Good evening. This is Dale Lamb, Gardner Webb. This is the 13th week of Mels 604, fall semester of 2016. Today is Wednesday, December the 7th. Our housekeeping for the evening. We'll cover Module 9 tonight, Curriculum Design Development. That was our weekly task. Read Chapter 6, view the YouTube video, discussion board. Just a note to you folks who are maybe running behind at this part of the semester, try to focus on your evidence artifact work rather than discussion boards if you don't have time for both. Hopefully you'll have time for both, but make sure that you try to finish up that evidence artifact work between now and spring semester. Don't go into 605 behind. It'll be a long haul if you do. So try to make sure that you get into the remainder of your evidence artifacts, and the only two components that are left for 605 are 5E and 6F, and so if you can get to that point. As a reminder, when you submit the final evidence narrative for each of the 6 evidence artifacts, for example, the app cell, make sure that when you submit that final comprehensive evidence narrative that has all 5 components in it, make sure you click on the button that says complete form and finish the summary and descriptors that go with that. If you don't know how to do summary and descriptors, go to Task Stream Tools on our main board here in Blackboard, and I have a document how to write task stream summary and descriptors. Please remember that by the end of, or by April 1st of next semester, you need to have 21 proof of competencies in your competency folio. I've covered that in previous weeks. I won't bore you with it again tonight. Most of you are working on that, but make sure that you understand that you only have to do 1 per competency for a total of 21, and everything will be due next semester by April 1st. Just kind of give you the deadline. All right. So let's look and see what we've got tonight. A long time ago when I was doing my doctorate at Chapel Hill, I came across Dr. Schlechte. He was a professor of education in the graduate school there. He's nationally known. His most famous work, coincidentally, is called Working on the Work. And from his book, Inventing Better Schools, an Action Plan for Education Reform, here are what he believes are 10 critical qualities of student work. Product focus, work that engages students almost always focuses on a product or performance of significance to them. It's not just busy work. There's a goal. There's a finish line, if you will. It's not just work for the sake of work. There is a project or performance or a product. Kind of like with you folks, your product is your portfolio work, and we have benchmarks along the way as you complete various components, and then various of the 6 evidences, and so that product focus is important in student work, not just giving you something to keep you busy for a certain amount of time. Clear and compelling standards. Students know exactly what's expected of them. That's why we have the scoring rubric, and why we align with the state standards for school administrators, the 21 competencies and the 37 descriptors, the 7 standards of public school administration that contain 37 descriptors. That's why we align our evidence artifact portfolio with those standards. Protection from adverse consequences for initial failures. Just like with you folks, you're allowed to submit your work for comments to begin with and allowed to revise it. And even once you submit it for evaluation, it can still be sent back for revision without punishment. That's important. Affirmation of the significance of the performance. Students are more highly motivated when other significant others known to them who think that the student's work is important. Portfolio assessments, which collect student work for people other than the teacher, can play a significant role in making student work more visible, just like with you folks. Yes, it goes to your teacher, and yes, it goes to your evaluators at Gardner Webb, but yes, it goes to the State Department for the affirmation that it is good work and that it's worthy of you being granted a license to practice in school administration in the state. Affiliation, not to be confused with group work. Students are more likely to be engaged about work that permits, encourages, and supports opportunities to then work independently with others. This is kind of like your peer reviews, especially your Zoom peer reviews, where you work independently, but then you get together and share as a group, but you have your own tasks to do along the way. It's not actually group work, it's affiliated work. Novelty and variety. Not doing the same old thing the same old way, not just taking written tests, but doing portfolio work for you folks. Choice. For each of the evidence artifacts, you have a choice of direction that you need to go. We give you a broad outline, but you pick the topic, and just like you form your PLC, you get to decide what the basis of that PLC is, who's going to be on your team. Authenticity. There's, real work. I mean, the whole evidence artifact portfolio that you folks are doing, while aligned with state standards, competencies, and descriptors, it also mimics the school improvement plan process. And that's what basically you're doing. You're doing what a principal would do in real life to develop their required school improvement plan. Under North Carolina State Statute 115C 288, that I'm sure you learned about in your 603 class, duties and responsibilities of the principals, you are legally responsible every year to produce a school improvement plan that uses stakeholders to put that plan together. And so the portfolio that we have you do at Gardner Webb and that other schools of education would have you do in principal training is authentic. It is exactly the process that you will follow to develop that required school improvement plan once you're in the job. Organization of knowledge. Students are more likely to be engaged when information and knowledge are arranged in a clear, accessible way. That's why we give you notes. That's why we give you directions. We give you rubrics, and we give it to you in an orderly fashion. And number 10, content and substance. You've got to commit yourselves to inventing work that engages all students and helps them attain rich and profound knowledge. Learning to read and write complete sentences, for example, is not the same as learning to write persuasively and to read critically, thoughtfully, and well. If such profound mastery is limited to students who are more socially or economically advantaged or otherwise capable of high-quality intellectual work without as much teacher effort, the dream of democracy cannot truly be realized. The whole notion here is that education is a path out for everybody, or it's a way to achieve for everybody. And you've got to engage all students and find levels of work or types of work or strategies that work, differentiated strategies that allow all students to participate at whatever level that they have. Recently, I was disturbed when I was working through with some of my interns, some work that had been sent back for revision. And my complaint was that the evaluator had not taken into consideration the level of access that the student had. In that particular clinical intern school, they did not have much access to the administration and all the things that some other students had access to. And I felt like we were penalizing that student for the level of access that they had. That's one of the things that we have to be clear about in public education is we can't penalize kids for their background or the level of access that they have in their homes. We have to work around those things and make sure that they do quality work within the access that they're given. The example that I was referring to had a PE teacher, and her PLC consisted of the PE teachers, and the evaluator felt like that she should have had access to academic teachers. Sorry, that's not the level of access that she had. She did a great job with her PLC and what they did, but her level of access was PE teachers. She did not have access to any other group of so-called core academic teachers in her building. That's not her fault. She exemplified what she should have been doing in the learning that took place, and she did at the level of access that she had. That's one of the things that we have to be careful of, is that we don't penalize kids for the level of access or knowledge that they bring from home. That's not what public schools are about. Public schools are not about the privileged. Public schools are for the great unwashed. We had private schools in this country long before we ever had public schools. Public education is to allow everyone access to the American dream. All right, so that's a quick and dirty on Dr. Schlechte. His most famous work, again, is called Working on the Work, which is a little earlier than this. I was with him back in the 80s, and so this was from the 90s. But his work is still probably the seminal work in quality work, authentic work, working on the work, giving work to students that is meaningful. He's still the expert in the area of student work. Okay. All right. You should be able to see a PowerPoint now. Should curriculum be standardized for all? The standardized curriculum movement started in 1983 with National Commission on Excellence in Education, NECE, and they published a work called A Nation at Risk. And said that students weren't learning anything because local standards weren't very rigorous. And so we had a call for higher standards in the state of North Carolina, what resulted in 1984 as a result of the Nation at Risk that came out in 83. In 1984, North Carolina passed the Basic Education Plan, which said every child must have a basic education. And to do that, we must devise a statewide curricula. And it was fully implemented by 1989, and it was called the Standard Course of Study. It stayed in place until 2 years ago when it was replaced with Common Core. But North Carolina's response to A Nation at Risk was, again, the Basic Ed Plan, and which spawned the Standard Course of Study. Now, the Standard Course of Study then spawned movement for accountability, which initially was known as performance-based accountability. I was principal at the time. We commonly referred to it as PBAP. And that morphed into the state ABC program. We said, well, we have a state curricula now. We must develop state testing to measure whether students are actually learning that curricula. And so we devised end of grade test for elementary through middle school students and end of course test for high school students. And that was our state response. And people said the standards-based movement in America is on solid footing, slowly but surely changing the way we think of teaching and learning, sets clear standards for what we want students to learn. Standards included content standards, benchmark student performance standards. Content standards broadly stated expectation of what students should be able to know and be able to do in particular subjects and grade levels. Again, we made it grade level specific. fourth grade, for the EOG, and course specific for high school. And we had standards and benchmarks. Standards are described in general terms, and content standards require more specific statements at each developmental level to facilitate integration of the curriculum. Benchmark describes specific developmental components of the general domain identified by the standard. You can read this stuff later. Okay, No Child Left Behind said that every child had to have a fair, equal, and significant opportunity to obtain a high-quality education. However, and then we had IDEA for special ed kids. And we thought this would help, especially EC kids, but then we found that standards-based reform posed challenges to special educators. Trying to hold EC kids to the same standard as general ed kids is unrealistic. And this is a story that the author of this particular PowerPoint did, that talked about the problem with individual state standards is that she moved from Georgia to Washington, and her kid was a year behind in math. And then she had a friend who moved from Michigan to North Carolina, and her kid was way ahead. So what we found, especially, I'll speak to North Carolina, is so that we norm these tests so that we only had a certain amount failing, regardless of the number that they got right. For example, I remember one year, fifth grade math test, kids only had to get 29% right to be considered on grade level. What we didn't want was so many kids failing, and we didn't want to have summer school for thousands of kids across North Carolina. And so we would basically manipulate what it took to be on grade level or to pass the test to make a 3. That's the problem with state standards, and that's the problem with No Child Left Behind. It causes a dumbing down. We don't want all of our kids to actually show up what they actually knew, and so we kept saying, we would lower the standard of how many they had to get right to be proficient, or to make a 3 and be passing. And that's the problem with state standards. Each state sets their own, and some are lower than the others. Unfortunately, North Carolina is one of those that very low. And you can manipulate those. Politicians manipulate those for political advantage. And then a lot of folks screamed and yelled that kids aren't learning as much, and so that they could attack public school, get vouchers, start charter schools, and start private corporations getting public funds. They saw it as a growth industry and billions of dollars out there, and we'll go grab it. But you have to scare people and tell them that their kids aren't learning anything in public school in order to do that. And so No Child Left Behind has not worked well. State standards in North Carolina specifically hasn't worked well. Again, academic standards vary widely from state to state. And that's why the push for federal standards, the Common Core. No Child Left Behind has created a race for the bottom. The standards were literally all over the map. If you want your kids to be proficient, you just lower the number of correct answers it took to make them proficient rather than to teach them more. That's the problem that we've had with standards in North Carolina. Let me see if I can show you an example of what I'm talking about. Okay. Okay. Okay, I didn't think I could. I'm going to give it one more try. Um, there was a high school in a rural county in North Carolina that was a part of a three high school system in that county. They had three high schools, and one fairly affluent, one middle class, and one poor. And that was not so much based on pupil assignment, but geographic location of the high schools. All of a sudden, the middle high school that had the middle class kids started scoring consistently higher than the high school that had the affluent kids. As in most small southern towns and counties, and especially in North Carolina, you have the county seat town, and the high school for that county seat generally has the more affluent, the doctors and lawyers. That's generally where the courthouse is, where all the lawyers live, all the doctors live, because generally that's where the hospital is, and so that school is generally more affluent. But in this particular county, the middle high school, the one with the middle class kids, all of a sudden started outscoring the um, the affluent high school, and was well above the state average. However, they didn't have kids that were well above state average, but they were scoring well above state average, and did that for, when the new principal came in, for a couple of years. And then in the third year of the new principal's tenure, and he had been praised, and people came from all over to see what magical things they were doing at that school, Common Core hit. And so now everybody knows the first year of Common Core testing in high schools, many of them dropped a good many points, generally between 20 and 30 percentage points. The other two high schools dropped about 20 points, but they stayed, in terms of the state average, they stayed exactly where they had been in terms of the state average. This particular high school dropped 56 points and went from 5 points above the state average to 15 points below the state average, and considerably below the other two. Two sad things here. One first sad thing is that there was about a 20 percentage point score inflation across North Carolina in terms of what kids actually knew. When you put them on a national exam, you realize that they weren't scoring near as well as the state had led folks to believe. And there was nothing wrong with the test. It was just a rigorous national test. Kids weren't used to that. They were used to a much easier state test. And so they didn't really know as much as they thought they knew. So again, that's why the push for national or federal standards, in that states were dumbing down the test to make their students look better than they were and to get them into colleges. And the second part is the sadder part of that story is that obviously there was some form of manipulation going on in that high school. My suspicion is that when the test came to the campus, that study guides were being made from the from the test, and students were given advanced knowledge of what the answers would be. That's part of high stakes testing. Also, is the cheating effect. We've had dozens of examples across the country, some as widespread as in Atlanta, where the whole system was cheating, and some school to school or district to district, and some, the whole district. I remember years ago we brought a consultant in when I was in Charlotte, Mecklenburg, and he was from a district in Texas, and we couldn't understand once he was paid and he presented his materials on how to get test scores up, we couldn't figure out how that would work. It was less than we were already doing. It wasn't long before he was caught up in a scandal with all Houston area schools where they had been cheating on the test. That's At the time, the National Secretary of Education had to resign because he had been the superintendent in Houston during that time. And so what we find is when we leave it up to states, they will manipulate, they will cheat, they will adjust. One of the things that we know is the physical amount of time that a test is on a school campus before it is given. The longer the test is there, the better school students will do. And so you do the math on how they do better. There was a time when we first started state testing in North Carolina that the principal had to go to a centralized location, pick up the exams that morning, take them back to school, have teachers waiting in the cafeteria. You passed out the exams, you collected the exams later that day, and you took them back to the central office for scoring that day. We went from that to the exams arriving as much as 2 weeks prior to their administration on campuses. And guess what? The more days that they're on campus, the better your kids do. They're supposed to remain somewhere locked in a secure location, but my hair wasn't supposed to have fallen out this early in life either. So No Child Left Behind, high stakes testing, punishment, being punished for the kids that you have, that's all part of comparative accountability. Now, we're trying to move into growth model accountability where we just grow kids one grade level each year. I've gone over the EVOS model with you, where we factor in the kid's circumstance and background and their level of access, their parents' income, mother's education, race, school district, high wealth district, low wealth. We factor all that in to what a year's growth would be. That is the only equitable way to measure what schools are doing. But again, it's got to be measured against a national standard. You can't give a little easy state test and then let it be on campus for days or weeks prior to administration and expect to get a true reading on how much kids are learning. So there's two parts to this. You got to have some national standards, and you've got to measure how much kids grow. You can't just measure them against some artificial standard of some affluent kids from somewhere. You have to measure them on their circumstances. Did you grow that kid a year? Regardless of where he started, is what's important is where he ended. Did he make a year's growth? He may still not be as far along as some other kids, but you did. You factored in what you got to work with, and so so here's what happens. Mississippi standardized tests on a Mississippi test showed 80% of fourth graders were proficient or better in reading. However, fewer than 30% of the same fourth graders were proficient when they were given the NAEP test, reading test, a national test. That's what I was talking about in North Carolina. That was a trap that we fell into. We were using our own tests and dumbing it down, making the test easier, but also manipulating the number of test items that had to be correctly answered to be considered on grade level or proficient. And then then when that wasn't enough, we started sending the test out days or weeks earlier, understanding that when you're being sanctioned, if you don't do well or your kids don't do well, that folks would figure out a way to get those test questions to those kids prior to them having to take the test. There's been many cases of that being discovered around North Carolina. You can Google those things and find out. So what we need is standardized testing that's based on a national test and a national curriculum, and that it's administrated the same way everywhere. Again, going back to the old system, a principal picks up test morning of administration, passes out to waiting teachers back at the school, and then collects the test later in the day. Teachers don't put their hands on them other than to take them to the room. They don't grade them or clean up stray marks or do any of that stuff that tends to make the scores go up. But one of the things that we have to understand is our kids are actually doing better now in public school than they've ever done before. A Nation at Risk was a political document trying to advance a certain agenda. Two researchers concluded have generally performed above average in comparison with students in other industrialized nations. Education is not crumbling and certainly not at risk. Nation at Risk promoted the myth of a failing public school and used it for political purposes. Had little to do and distorted the picture of American schools. There's no evidence to support that public schools are collapsing. Average American high school and college student is now doing as well or perhaps slightly better than they did ever before. Student achievements remaining steady or slowly rising across the land, but also student intelligence. Nation at Risk focused attention on school reform. It made Americans suspicious of their schools, but politicians and reformers seized the report and use it to attack schools to advance their own agendas. Those agendas, far right used it as manufactured an opportunity to take control of schools and ban ideas they found ideologically distasteful. That was the push for statewide curricula, and we could ban things like creation, evolution, and just teach creationism, the Bible, and not teach science. It also tried to marginalize or exclude things like gay rights, abortion rights, birth control, things of that nature. So, and these conservatives wanted schools returned to good old days before they'd been captured by social experimentalists who were advocates of whole language, new math, and sex ed in school. Report also served a political agenda. The homeschoolers, the voucher supporters who want public funds to pay for their private education, and advocates of alternative to public schools, which are charter schools. These people all have a financial agenda in mind, or the homeschoolers have a sometimes religious or political agenda in mind. So public education is strong. Public education is doing its job. But we as the professionals in the field need to advocate for a national curricula with national testing and standards about how we give out that test and get an accurate measure of what our kids are doing. The Nation at Risk paved the way for No Child Left Behind, conservative school agenda that has little to do with real reform. It's not a step in the right direction. Deeply damaging, mostly ill-intentioned law. No one generally committed to improving public schools should want to have anything to do with it. The test, problem with the test is that we aren't measuring 21st century skills. It's a kind of a dumbing down. And because of that, we're falling behind other countries in certain areas, but that's because we're dumbing down. We're not teaching the entire curricula. We're focusing on narrow agendas, and we're focusing on state-made tests that we know are dumbed down or cheated on. And so you can look at the rest of these things. But going forward, we in the field need to advocate for national norms, national standardized curricula nationally, legitimate tests that measure what kids have learned and not just on the surface in terms of multiple choice, but more deeper. We need to get deeper rather than shallower in terms of what we teach and test. And we need to make sure that we cover less material, but cover it more deeply, and make sure that we focus on 21st century skills. And we all know what those are: communication, technology. critical thinking, problem solving, real world problems, those kinds of things. Good assessment systems combine centralized assessment that use open-ended and essay questions. Critical skills. Multiple choice tests like state tests focus on low-level skills or just rote and recall kind of things. All right, so our standards are shallow. A mile wide and an inch deep. And in contrast, high achieving countries teach fewer test topics each year, but teach them more thoroughly. So this is a good one for all of you budding curriculum specialists and principals who understand that curriculum drives your school. So again, this is under Zoom session 13. And that's that one. All right. This one on standards-based education is much the same. It talks about the needs for standard-based education. It's a little more academic in nature, but it covers pretty much the same material as the previous one. And then I have one for you here on standardized testing that speaks that debates the argument, should standardized tests be increased or decreased, or standardized school test fair. And kind of the bottom line on this one is if they're the right kind of standardized tests that have open-ended and essay, but standardized tests that only do multiple choice are especially harmful to lower income students and minority students because they're basically rote and recall type things. And so this is a good one that explores the argument of standardized testing, that when you have parents who complain, this does speak to, standardized testing done wrong is bad, but done right, it is a better assessment of what your child actually knows. And in a world that is becoming smaller through technology and globalization, your children are going to have to compete with kids from everywhere, not just from your local area, in terms of jobs and economic prosperity. This is a good one for you to go through. I won't spend the time on it. The first one tonight is near and dear to my heart because I lived all that stuff. This one is a good one too for standardized testing. All right. I think that's all I have that I wanted to cover tonight on that. I do want to kick off. Let me close that one and go back here. Share screen this time. I do want to kick off next week. I'm going to spend just a few minutes. Next week, we're going to talk about interviewing for a job. I do want to kick that off tonight. I want to start that with my top 10 for job interviews. Now, remembering there are 4 levels of interviews. The first one is they give you maybe a set of test scores or data and you have to interpret it, or they have a set of questions, or they ask you a set of questions to try to determine your strengths and weaknesses. Those we'll go through each of those 4 levels of interviews next week, but tonight I want to start that by introducing what I believe are top 10 for job interviews, and I hope you can see this on your screen. I believe it is shared. So let's get started on that one. My top 10 for job interviews. Now, I have interviewed hundreds. maybe even thousands, and I've hired hundreds of teachers. I've hired probably over 100 administrators um, during my 32 years in public school business, and I have worked in principal preparation for gosh, um, full time for about 6 years now, since 2010, and part time as an adjunct for about 15 years prior to that. So I believe I've been in the principal preparation business for about 21 years, and then public schools for 32. So quite a while. Some of that time overlap, but quite a while. And so these are the things from interviews, either principal interviews or assistant, more importantly, assistant principal interviews for you folks. This is what I've come up with as my most important 10 things as you going as a teacher or at some other level into your first administrative interview for your first administrative or assistant principal job. So here we go. Dress for success. I have humorous stories that I could tell you about the way people have come and dressed. My favorite is I had an assistant principal candidate who came in. He was on teacher work day, and he was working around the building. He came in dirty clothes. I didn't mind that, but he wore his cheap wig that day. He had a hairpiece on, and it was kind of knocked crooked on the side of his head, and I couldn't focus on anything but that he was wearing a wig. He should have at least wore his good wig that day. But try to look as professional as possible. If you wear a wig, wear your good wig. Whatever your best clothes are, that's what you need to have on. Take a 2-page evidence summary with you that you can leave with your interviewer, be able to refer to your activity without reading. That speaks to your evidence artifacts. They won't want to read all of them, but you should develop a 2-page summary we have you write a summary of each of the 6 evidence artifacts that go into task stream. Take those 6 summaries and pare them down to 2 pages. One of the things you're supposed to take on all interviews is a portfolio of your work. That's the work that you have. That's the work that you've actually done in your school, but you can't take 100 pages. Pare it down to 2 pages and be able to speak to what you did in each of those 6 evidence artifacts in your portfolio without having to look at notes. Now, the reason I say that is this: most of the people who are going to be interviewing you are going to be a little bit older and a little further into the process. Now, 10 years from now, this won't be necessary. But right now, the majority of the people that are interviewing you came through the old system where they just took their courses and took a national exam called the ISLIC, or a state exam called the ISLIC, or the Praxis NTE, according to how old they are. I took the NTE. I'm so old, I didn't even take the ISLIC. So these folks are going to be curious as to what you did. If they haven't had an intern of their own, they're going to be curious as to what you did in your portfolio that you submitted for your licensure. You should be able to put a 2-page piece of paper in their hand and speak to that paper that says, during my app sale, I created the PLC for math, and we instituted Algebra A1, 1A, and 1B. Something like that. I mean, it's just quick, and take those 6 summaries that you wrote with your final evidence narratives. When you put them in task stream, take those 6, put them together, and then edit them down to just the most salient points, 2 pages, double spaced. I think I even have an example of one of those on your intern materials page. If I don't, I'll post it. Then you'll be able to refer to that when they ask you what you did during your internship. Research both the school and school administration. Look at the state report card and the teacher working conditions survey. Know the backgrounds of the administrative team so you can speak to them. Sometimes they'll ask you for your 5-year plan, but sometimes they'll ask, what would you do? What would be a 5-year plan for that school, or a 2-year plan? Well, if you haven't seen their state report card and don't know where they are, and if you haven't seen the teacher working conditions survey, just, on staff satisfaction, basically, then you won't be able to speak to 2 years down the road or 5 years down the road. That's one of those questions they love to ask you. Where do you see yourself in 2 years or 5 years, or where do you see the school in 2 or 5 years? Know the backgrounds of the administrative team so you don't say something dumb like, PE teachers are stupid. Well, the principal might have been a former PE teacher. And know their strengths and weaknesses, if at all possible. Know what you don't know. Be able to be conversant in EVOS, Power School, Power Source, RTI, PBIS, and school finance. Be able to speak to instruction and the bottom line, which is student achievement. Now, what I mean by know what you don't know. Make sure that during your internship that you have somebody show you EVOS, Power School, Power Source, all these other things from the administrative side. Yes, you have a portal as a teacher into Power School, but it looks nothing like that on the administrative side. There's a lot more to it than what goes in there in terms of test scores, discipline incidents, attendance, all the things that go in there. RTI looks much different on the management side than it does on the teacher side. So does PBIS. So does school finance. EVOS, know that there are independent, the independent variable is determined by which is the projected score a kid has to show for a year's growth, is dependent upon independent variables that are dependent variables that calculate that, like income and race and education, those kinds of things factor into that projected score. Know those kinds of things. Understand school finance in terms of the budget. That different teachers are paid out of different sources. Different monies come in and can be used only for, what federal funds come in. They pay for CTE, Title I, special ed, AG, state funds, what they're used for, state paid teachers versus locally paid teachers, those kinds of things. And all of that stuff, and be able to relate all that back to student achievement. Have a humorous anecdote about how you were able to turn a negative into a positive. Everybody likes to hear that. Be prepared to discuss hours and responsibilities honestly. I was relating a story to one of my colleagues not long ago that I went to visit one of my interns at a school that we're both familiar with in a district that we both worked in at one time. And a month into the school, the new AP was no longer there, and I asked the principal why, and she said, well, she wasn't honest with me about working. It was a late start elementary school that had a large pre-K program, and so they couldn't get all the kids in at one time because of the use of the buses. So they started the pre-K and got all those kids in, and then when they did, they started the regular elementary school at 9:30. Pre-K started at 8:30, and the regular elementary starts at 9:30 and goes to 4:30. And they hired a new AP, and one of the first things she told the principal was, "Well, I've got to leave every day at 4 o'clock and go pick up my kids." What do you mean you got to leave? We don't even get, the kids don't even get out till 4:30. We don't even clear the bus lot till 4:45. Teachers can't leave till 5 o'clock every day. And you're going to leave an hour earlier than the teachers every day and expect to be an administrator? So you need to be prepared to discuss hours and responsibilities honestly. And remember, if the school is an hour away from your house, it's not going to get any closer when you get the job. Those are things that you have to talk about. If you've got responsibilities after school with children, or weekends, or if if you get old and you have to take care of your parents, or those are things that you got to talk to people honestly about. I used to make when I was a high school principal, I had 5 assistant principals and two deans of students, so I had 7, and me made 8 on our administrative team. It was 4A high school in Charlotte, or 4AA high school in Charlotte. So we had 8 on the administrative team, and we would have an intern team most any time. And so I was able, for one of my older APs who didn't like driving at night, to assign her duties where she didn't have to do supervision at night. We had that luxury, but we have to know those things up front. We have to factor those things in. So you need to be honest about those things. Know your strengths and weaknesses. Know thyself. We have you do the VARC and several other things to try to get to know yourself. Lewin's leadership style, all that stuff that we do in 604 And 605 to try to get you to understand who you are. You need to know what your strengths and weaknesses are, and you can speak to those and what plans you have to work on those weaknesses. That's what they're going to ask you. What's your weakness and what are you going to do about it? You need to know what those are. Don't discuss salary, experience steps, national board pay, etc. Principal doesn't have anything to do with that. If you're concerned about that, then you need to talk with the folks, prior to interviewing. You need to talk to folks in human resources about, I have a master's degree and I'm getting paid for that, and I've got national board pay. How's that going to affect me if I become an assistant principal? You need to talk with the appropriate people in human resources about that. So one of the, I have my 603 students interview somebody in HR about compensation, and not only compensation, but benefits for that very reason, to find out who that person is in their district. So that if you have questions about those kinds of things, about what's going to happen to me salary-wise, benefits-wise when I become an AP, they can talk to that person. Talking to the principal about it is not the appropriate thing to do. Don't engage in gossip or negative talk. Principals go to a meeting 2 or 3 times a month, 3 or 4 in some districts. They'll tell it. And so if you talk negatively or gossip, it'll get back to the people that you work with. Don't enter. And then the last one, and this will close us down for the night, and this is my number one pet peeve. Don't interview for a job you wouldn't take just for the experience of interviewing. Let me say that again. If you know the school is an hour and a half from your home and you would never work there, or because of the kind of school it is, don't go interview there just for the experience. You're wasting the interviewer's time, and word will spread. My job as a principal to try to find somebody to work at our school and will be an asset to our administrative team. My job is not to get you experience interviewing so you can get the job at the good school that you really want to work at. That's not my deal. And that's insulting to the people that you go and interview with. So if you know that you don't want to work at that particular grade level, or you don't want to work in that part of town, or that school's too far from you, then don't go over there and interview. Oh, I need the experience interviewing. So when it comes to the good school, yeah, but that word gets out too. And trust me, you won't get hired anywhere if that word gets out, because administrators tend to stick together. Even the people who are at the more affluent schools have empathy for those principals who aren't, because they know they may be there. With strategic staffing that's going on in districts around the state, where principals that are successful at good schools get sent to the low performing schools, they know that the shoe may be on their foot before long, and they don't want people doing them that way. And so the word will get out. If you just, I wouldn't ever work here, I just wanted to interview for the experience of interviewing, that's not our job to get you experience as administrators. So that's the one. I have a top 10 for the first faculty meeting when you become a school leader. You can read those on your own, because hopefully you'll get that job. I'll let you do that. But this can be found under week 14. And again, next week we'll wrap it up, and I will go through the interviewing. I've kicked it off earlier this semester, but I will go through there and we will talk about the 4 levels of interviews. And but this one is a general one that's a good one, as a good primer for job interviews. Read over it, follow these, and you'll be more successful in your job search. All right, I will see you all next Wednesday at 7. As always, if you have questions, comments, problems, issues, don't hesitate to call or email me. I'll have this posted on YouTube by 9 o'clock tonight. So y'all all have a good week. I'll see you next Wednesday.